So yeah, today we've got Tom, Biruk, and Fana Tom's from Manchester, Biruk's from Oxford, and Fana from Addis, talking about powering development with political economy of electricity generation in Ethiopia. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves and share their work, and we'll move on to questions at the end.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Roshan, and thanks everyone for coming along on a busy day for Ethiopia and Ethiopian politics. Yeah, so this paper that we're going to present today is part of the politics stream of research within FutureDAMS, which has been focusing on the Nile and the Volta basins. And this paper is written by myself, Biruk, and Fana. So Biruk's going to sort of present the second half of the paper, and Fana will join in the Q&A at the end. And the paper focuses on the electricity planning process in the EPRDF era, so primarily from 91 up until 2019. And is part of a book project. So the idea is this will be one chapter within a book. So although this paper doesn't address sort of more recent events, that's going to be covered in hopefully some of our forthcoming work. And the rationale of this paper basically is that developing countries currently face a fairly challenging situation where, on the one hand, they are required to make massive investments in electricity generation and transmission in order to expand access to electricity for their populations, as well as powering, hopefully, industrial expansion and other economic activity. But at the same time are expected to sort of abandon the use of fossil fuels and turn increasingly towards renewable technologies to fuel this expansion in electricity access. And in that sense, Ethiopia is quite an interesting case study in that over the past 3 decades, Ethiopia's been a sort of leading example of a state-led development experience where the state has taken a major role in expanding infrastructure through very, very large-scale investments, particularly in this case in hydropower. And much more recently in work not covered here, also attempting to crowd in investment into non-hydro renewables as well. And so essentially the research questions that this paper tries to address are, one, to try and understand what factors actually shape this process of electricity sector planning, in recognition that dams and electricity are both deeply political processes as well as being highly complex and technically sophisticated. And in particular, trying to understand under what circumstances does the balance between politics and technical expertise lead to positive outcomes in terms of expanding generation of electricity. So theoretically, I won't spend too long on this, but in terms of the sort of theoretical reference points that we're looking at, I mean, a big sort of influence on our thinking was around this idea of elite cohesion, which a number of authors such as David Walder, Donor and others have argued is a key part of the process of structural transformation. Now they focus primarily on industrial policy and to some degree the infrastructure required to underpin industrial expansion, and argue that essentially one of the key factors in the success primarily of a number of East Asian countries was this idea of elite cohesion, when there's centralization of power and coherence amongst key political and economic elites. That then leads to the kinds of industrial policies that ultimately lead to structural transformation. Now, our view is that a lot of these insights are quite relevant for infrastructure development as well, and also investments within the electricity sector. So where, elite cohesion is, hypothesized to lead to a long time horizon, which obviously is extremely important in electricity sector planning, and particularly in the development of hydropower projects, which take many years to conceptualize, to actually then construct and to then realize the advantages of the high upfront investments in dam projects. Elite cohesion also leads to a sort of clear developmental vision very often, and the ability to then integrate policies across a number of sectors into that clear vision. And also means that where you have centralized control at the political level, you can also then sort of reduce your emphasis on essentially buying political support through financing consumption, and then devote more resources to prioritizing investment in long-run economic development. Now, while there's a lot of insights that you can draw from that literature for infrastructure and for the electricity sector, one of the things we argue is that there's a sort of an implicit assumption within a lot of that work that once elite cohesion is in place, that technical capacity will follow. That once you have these highly coherent centralized power, elites will then start to invest in the technical capacity that then will deliver on those political ambitions. Yet at the same time, this sort of risks quite significantly oversimplifying the process when you come to a sector like the electricity sector, which is extremely complex and highly technical. Actually building capacity within the electricity sector is a long-term, complicated process, and in particularly empowering that expertise, and not one that should be sort of underestimated and assumed that they will necessarily follow on from intra-elite politics. So to turn to the case study, I'll start with a little bit of background for those of you not terribly familiar with Ethiopia. So we're looking particularly at the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front government, which was in power from 91 until its dissolution in 2019. And they came to power as part of a Maoist insurgency, strongly influenced by socialist thinking, and took power of the national government in 1991 under the leadership of sort of the key figure, Meles Zenawi, who was subsequently made prime minister, who's the right hand on the right hand of that black and white image at the top there. Now, once they were in power, they underwent something of a shift in ideology over time, and particularly during the 1990s, there was a considerable degree of growing factionalism within the ruling party as they were working out these different ideological viewpoints. And a key moment most people would recognize was the major split that took place within the ruling party in 2001, which very much led to the centralization of power around then Prime Minister Meles, and the space essentially for him to articulate what he outlined as his developmental state ideology, drawing heavily on East Asia and attempting to position the state as sort of the central actor who would transform the Ethiopian economy, focusing on massive infrastructure expansion and industrialization. And then one of the sort of next major junctures within the Ethiopian politics was then in 2012 when Meles passed away. And from that point on, you gradually then had this sort of disintegration and fragmentation of what had been at that point a very highly centralized and extremely cohesive elite politics, which it forms the backdrop of the sort of the recent events in Ethiopia. But also had important impacts on economic policy in the years following 2012. Now, interestingly, despite this sort of growing fragmentation within the electricity sector where we're focused, decision-making actually remained quite highly centralized for much of this period, with Dr. Gebresenbet, whose picture is there on the bottom right, retaining quite considerable control given his roles as Deputy Prime Minister for the economic cluster, with responsibility for overseeing and putting together the economic aspects of the National Development Plan in 2015, and also he was head of the chair of the board of Ethiopian Electric Power at that time. So for a number of different roles, had quite outsized influence over decision-making within the electricity sector. It's worth thinking a little bit around sort of the EPRDF's approach to electricity. Right from the very beginning, even before it had taken national power, there was a clear sort of emphasis on promoting industrialization and structural transformation of the economy, initially influenced by Marxist rationales, but in particular after 2001, with this idea of the developmental state forming, very strongly focused on massive state investment in infrastructure development, with electricity, cheap electricity being seen as a key support to the development of manufacturing as a form of an industrial policy. And this in turn led to a very particular model of production within the electricity sector, an approach to the electricity sector, which essentially required massive state investment in hydropower, and acceptance within the government that the state-owned electricity companies would accumulate very large debts, because essentially you're making these massive investments for long-term for the long-term production of electricity, while ensuring that prices remain very low both for manufacturing firms and for domestic users as well. So accepting that these state-owned firms are going to run at a loss. And although from 2002 onwards, technically the private sector could invest in electricity generation, the low tariffs for electricity pretty much effectively excluded any private investment in electricity generation. And throughout this period as well, I mean, the likes of the World Bank had repeatedly pushed for liberalization and privatization in Ethiopia, as they had in many other countries, in electricity and other sectors. But this influence was actively resisted on the government side, which was committed to this idea that state investment and long-run investment would be key to sort of underpinning the manufacturing sector and the structural transformation of the economy. And it's also, useful to think through the sort of the relationships between this political elite and the bureaucracy. So right from the time that EPRDF came into power, there was this considerable distrust between the political class and the civil service, to the point where one early quote from around that term in the early 90s was that, having defeated the Derg, the previous government, the EPRDF viewed the civil service as the next enemy that we have to fight, where essentially the civil service was seen as an obstacle to development, and not rather than necessarily a sort of a major source of support in this politically driven development project. So it was very much throughout this period seen as though the political elite was driving this development project and driving this vision of structural transformation of the economy almost in the face of bureaucratic resistance, and that it was the job of the political elite to really drive the developmental ambitions of the country, and push the bureaucrats to then deliver on these political ambitions. So despite the fact that the government was claimed to be building a developmental state in Ethiopia along the lines of the East Asian countries, there was a quite distinct relationship in that respect between the politicians and the bureaucrats, compared to what is usually considered to be the case in much of East Asia. So Chalmers Johnson's famous view that the politicians reign and the bureaucrats rule in relation to the Japanese lead industry and lead agency in industry was quite different from the relationship that actually took place within Ethiopia. So rather than the bureaucrats and technocrats being empowered to make the key decisions based on their industry knowledge, it was very much the case that the politicians were driving decision making and making the key decisions, with bureaucrats then expected to implement political decisions. So at that point, I will hand over to Biruk, who will take you through some of the details of the case study that we carried out.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, my name is Biruk, so I'm one of the co-authors, and I'll sort of cover in the rest of this presentation the empirics behind what Tom has just described in this relationship between the technocrats and the bureaucrats and the politicians in the electricity sector. So we may start with, I think we jumped some slides if I'm not mistaken. No, this is right. Yes. So this may seem overwhelming at first, but I'll talk you through these slides so we get a sense of what exactly we are describing here. In the early 2000s, the Ethiopian Energy Corporation started developing these periodic power sector master plans, PSMPs. You see those in red lines. So the red lines are sort of projections, and these master plans modeled future demand based on current usage at the time, the expected growth, and would propose the sequencing of projects based on a set of feasibility studies, etc. And EPCO produced in 2003 this first line that you see at the bottom. Do you see my mouse? Is that visible to?
I can, but then it's my computer, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. Rose says yes. You know, this was the first EPCO master plan that was adopted in the Sustainable Development and Poverty Reduction Program, which was one of the first, not one of the first, but sort of a set of these periodic master plans that the EPRDF produced. And these orange dots here illustrate what the target was at the time for energy production. And so the master plans very much fed into the government's overall energy installed capacity targets that you see here in 2005. And this was met with the sort of completion of Gibe 1 dam in 2004, as you see in the document. By the time we get to 2005, the EPRDF developed its second 5-year plan, the Plan for Accelerated and Sustained Development to End Poverty, PASDEP. And there suddenly you see a sort of tripling of targets for installed capacity, which is indicated by this orange dot at the top, sort of installed capacity targets by 2010. Now, you could argue that 2005 elections were part of that rationale to say, look, we need to ensure that we win these elections, and therefore we need to come up with quite ambitious targets. But what you see here is that there was no basis for this in the power sector master plan. So the technocrats that developed the power sector master plan, the second one in 2005, you know, there was quite a mismatch between what ended up making it into the PASDEP, into the government's overarching targets, and what was developed by the technocrats in the master plan. And so this was the first sign that there's sort of a gap between the ambitions of the politicians and the more pragmatic approach of the technocrats, if you will. And this is nicely summarized by, apologies, nicely summarized by the quote at the top there by one of the Prime Minister's former advisors. We had planned for 7% year growth and unexpectedly found 10% one year. This demonstrated to us that double-digit growth is possible and that it should be maintained. You know, so in 2004, you see sort of an acknowledgement that ambitions can be increased and that these can also be potentially attained. But the sort of situation pretty quickly changes. By 2010, installed capacity was outstripping demand, though in the context of low access to electricity, of course. But ambitious growth targets, the desire to export energy in the long term, the new electrified railway network, sort of raised the need to overwhelm the problem. You know, these ambitions were rising. The EPRDF was positioning itself as a developmental state, very quickly moved from being a nascent developmental state to articulating it to proclaiming to be an active developmental state to being a successful developmental state in a very short period of time. And part of what was needed was high installed capacity. But at this stage, you know, you could see that the political leadership had subverted any technical process in the planning. 2010 was the next 5-year plan by the EPRDF, the Growth and Transformation Plan. And you can already see with the yellow dot on the slide, that was the target by 2015 for installed capacity in the EPRDF's GTP. The master plan of the power sector, again illustrated with the red line, highlights again a much more realistic view of what was possible and what was projected in the future. So the gap here was starting to increase dramatically. There was no resemblance, targets were overambitious, and were not met by the end of GTP1. Bellas Dam at this point was the only additional significant addition with 420 megawatts. But yeah, you could see that the problem of overwhelming, the solution of overwhelming the problem resulted in rather implausible targets. And as another former minister said, we completed one project, but the demand had grown. The only way was to overwhelm the problem. So GTP1 period in 2015 ends with targets not having been met, and installed capacity still somewhat ahead of peak demand. GTP2 is now the planning period between 2016 and 2020. And here really we see an outlandish mismatch. What is instructive, sorry, I should have mentioned in the previous slide, what is instructive here is that GTP1 actually only had targets for installed capacity and not energy generation, and I'll get back to that at a later point. By the time we get to the Growth and Transformation Plan 2, all of these problems had been compounded. A new power sector master plan was produced by foreign consultants, which included forecasts for future energy and peak demand. But these projections were based on the assumption of having met previous targets, which had not been the case, as I just illustrated in the previous slide. Take, in addition to that, the new ambitious industrial parks program, the general expectation of growth, sort of dramatically increased the targets. And at the insistence of the political leadership, and particularly again, Dr. Gebresenbet, the 2025 targets were even pushed to 2020, citing that Ethiopia needed to make power available before reaching middle income status. This meant essentially that the second Growth and Transformation Plan 2 not only wanted to meet the targets it set out now, but also meet GTP1 targets in a 5-year process. As this quote by another former minister illustrates, the targets were very high. Prime Minister Meles used to say it's backbreaking heavy investments, pushing ourselves. That is the philosophy. And as you see on the graph, the power sector plans were nowhere close to what the targets had now stated. And the mismatch between political ambition in the target setting and power sector planning was increasingly getting out of hand. At the same time, the power sector plans themselves were deeply problematic because they were based on wrong assumptions, based on unmet targets in the past. And so this created quite a problematic trajectory in the entire sector. And by 2016, Gibe 3 had been completed. This added 1,870 megawatts. This was very important for generation capacity of the country, but it barely even made a dent in approaching some of these targets. What's incredible here is even if GERD had been completed by that time, it would still have not met the targets, just to give you a sense of how outrageous these targets were, as one donor official stated. So these political ambitions had a number of implications, for the technocracy and the bureaucracy at large. On the one hand, the EPRDF wanted to tackle the burden of generations in building generation capacity. It wasn't just about being ambitious in these targets, but these were fundamentally implausible. And in our analysis, we don't just focus on the fact that the politicians overruled the technocrats, but illustrate what exactly that meant technically and financially. And so there was a lack of focus on transmission and distribution, for example, because there was such a deep focus on building new dams and focusing on installed capacity. And I'll get to that in a second. Secondly, the master plans became increasingly meaningless, as I just mentioned. It was garbage in and garbage out, as one consultant said. The data and the projections, the assumptions that were used were meaningless. In fact, there were tensions between the consultants and the EEP, where the EEP demanded that GTP1 targets were included in the input, even though consultants said, look, these assumptions were never met, these targets were never met, why would we use this as an input in making projections towards the future? So you get a sense of the cyclical nature of the planning process, where political pressure to meet high targets resulted in technocrats at times knowingly including assumptions that were faulty. This also meant massive debt accumulation with no attempt to recover costs. And a major issue that often is underreported is the inattention to maintenance. 4,300 megawatts of installed capacity at the moment should be enough to meet peak demand, but much of this capacity is not available because of poor maintenance. Up to 2,700 megawatts, according to one EEP official, is operational because of maintenance. An example here would be Terrefe Dam. So the focus on headline grabbing new dams, installed capacity meant that maintenance was neglected. Lastly, and most importantly, these ambitious targets had a particular impact on the actual design of hydropower dams. As I mentioned, there was a focus on installed capacity rather than energy generation. And it's important to separate between these two. Installed capacity of a power plant, often measured in megawatts, is the maximum amount of electricity that can be generated at one single point in time. This is important to generate sufficient electricity to meet peak demand at any given point in the day or in the year when demand is at its maximum. In contrast, energy generation capacity is really the amount of electricity produced over a given period of time, often measured in gigawatt hours. This is important to meet total demand of electricity all year round. And this also depends on water availability and the specific hydrology of the dam. The latter obviously isn't as politically attractive as the former. Installed capacity gives you, headline grabbing numbers, and the politicians increasingly were very much focused on that. Repeatedly, our interviewees and our interlocutors would tell us that they were so focused on installed capacity. For instance, the non-energy experts got hooked on installed capacity. The energy targets played a minor role. They didn't perceive so much attention. The focus was installing as much as peaking capacity as possible. This policymaking was conceived at the highest levels. It was not even in the ministry. It was the prime minister, deputy prime minister, and the advisors, but most of them were not energy specialists. Yes, second senior energy official. They look at size in terms of megawatts and assume that big megawatts is what matters. By increasing the installed capacity, they have just increased the unit cost of the energy sector. And that latter part is important because obviously that is also more expensive. In Ethiopia, though, total installed capacity is already higher than required to meet peak demand. While energy generation is actually much tighter and closer to current demand. And so the focus, according to a lot of the engineers, should have been on energy generation rather than capacity, also considering that turbines are quite expensive. The one way of measuring this is to look at the plant factors, which is a proportion of time a plant is able to operate at full capacity. And unfortunately, because of this focus on installed capacity by politicians, you had a set of dams with low plant factors, which in the Ethiopian context, as I've just explained, was not ideal. And so again, this is a sort of technical consequence of politicians taking over the planning process and oftentimes overruling some of the, not just overruling the technocrats, but also shaping the process through which technocrats operated in their master planning, which resulted in faulty master plans, as I've illustrated. So yeah, as you see here, the plant factors of 4 dams, quite low. which again, in the specificities of the Ethiopian context and the way the energy sector is structured, made little sense. So to conclude, the electricity sector is emblematic of successes and failures of the EPRDF's developmental state project. What we've just described in the electricity sector is not just planning processes in the electricity sector. It very much translates to sectors, whether it's transport, whether it's urban planning. This idea that big targets, headline-grabbing investments were preferred to a more careful, pragmatic approach. The idea that these targets were back-breaking, that pushing yourself and perhaps not reaching that targets, but pushing ahead was more important. And at the same time, a tenfold increase in generation capacity took place even before the completion of the GERD. And it's important to acknowledge that a lot of strides have been made. But again, politically driven overambition undermined the planning process. As I've just said, generation capacity over distribution and maintenance, inefficient mega projects that had financial consequences, and a hydro dependence that we address more specifically in a different paper, but also the sort of specific design of the dams driven by installed capacity. So, the question is, or the main takeaway is that there are limits to politically driven development focused on elite cohesion, given that that does not necessarily translate into technical expertise. And as long as politicians undermine highly technical sectors in their decision-making, are we approaching something of an anti-technical machine or not? And I'll leave it there, and we're happy to answer any questions and clarify some of the technicalities in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Biruk. That was really interesting. A lot of parallels to our work in Ghana as well, especially with the focus on large projects and lack of maintenance and stuff. So I'm going to open the room. I think we've got a small enough group that we can, take any questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. That makes it easier for us to call on you. The raise hand button is in the reaction thing, which is on your bottom right.
Hi there, can you hear me? Okay, firstly, thank you for the wonderful and insightful project. I'm Mohammed from South Africa, so and I'm a researcher at Stellenbosch University's Center for Sustainable Transitions. So being from South Africa means that I am quite familiar with the South African context, which is quite similar to obviously Ethiopia, if there are any similarities, that is. I'd just like to ask, Tom, you spoke about factionalism in the ruling party. I'd just like to ask whether there have been any differing views within the ruling party, within those factions, towards the sort of developmental state approach towards industrialization. Thank you so much.
Great. Are we getting a number of questions, or?
I already saw a question in the chat that I'm happy.
I'll just read that. Evarista is asking: is there a binary between state and technical staff, or is it much nuanced than that? So you guys can take the two, and then we'll do another round.
Okay, great. Who wants to go first? Fana, do you want to chip in, or?
Okay, let me try. So to respond to the question from a colleague from South Africa, the major difference I see, when it comes to this kind of factionalism or infighting over this developmental state project was during the design of the writing or the drafting of the 2015 of the second GTP document. By then, Melissa has already died, and that obviously created some kind of room to contest ideas, and the kind of debate or factionalism was not so much about on whether to continue with this developmental state or not, but the role that the private sector should have, and that has also played out in the over the coming 5 years between 2015 and 2020, and now we see a lot of room for private actors to engage in the electric sector as well as other sectors. Tom, Biruk, do you want to add? Or?
I mean, yeah. So yes, I agree with that very much. I mean, I guess the other in the presentation, I think I referred to factionalism in the 1990s prior to the split in the ruling party, and I guess it kind of depends quite who you believe. I mean, I think most of the people we spoke to seem to suggest that there was sort of a from a movement which had come from very deep engagement with Marxist-Leninism as they were making this transition, and as people like Mullers were getting interested in the the experiences of Korea and Taiwan and the role of capitalism. I think there was something of a division at that time between these factions around the role of the private sector, and whether the aim was to build a socialist economy or to build a capitalist one, and that sort of was one of the decisions which seems to have come out of that split to sort of resolve in terms of building a capitalist economy. But yeah, so I think at different points within this whole process there have been debates internally within these factions around different viewpoints on different forms of economic policy. The question in the chat, a binary between the state and technical staff. Yes, I think it's probably worth highlighting that our picture is probably a little caricatured in that at points certainly the bureaucracy itself has become politicized, and you've had political appointees being positioned into sort of senior civil service roles, and party members increasingly occupying parts of the civil service. So I mean, I think yes, there is undoubtedly some blurring of that process of that division. But at the same time, and I think it was, my view would be that sort of the EPRDF itself was very top down and very centralized, with the result that amongst the political leadership there was it was relatively separated from the civil service, even though at sort of lower levels down, the sort of the state and party very much blurred together. There was quite a clear distinction between the political leadership, who was sort of making the choices and making decisions which were then passed down through the levels, and then the lower level officials who were then expected to actually implement them. I'm not sure if others want to sort of express a view on that as well.
No, I agree. Maybe just to add, I think the head of the Ethiopian Electric Power Corporation would probably be a political figure rather than a technical figure. And so it's not so much a clean split among the institutions, but more within the institutions, as Tom just stated, and that lower ranking officials who were working on the day-to-day technical stuff. I mean, electrical engineering is not something that you can learn overnight as a politician. So not so much your institutional affiliation matters here, but the actual technicality of your knowledge is, I guess, where the split in the paper takes place. But a clean Weberian split obviously doesn't make sense.
We've got one in the chat, but if anyone else would like to ask something. I think absolutely. Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tom, Biruk, and Fana. That's a very interesting presentation. I look forward to reading the paper. I have a few comments and probably / questions. in terms of I think that there's the difference between the technical experts and the politicians, especially within the power sector. There were two, I think, important institutions, right? It's the power company and the power authority. And I think the company also had some, in terms of at least even building and supervising of building processes, they had some role, I think, but there were some rather long time serving technocrats, such as, I don't know, I remember this name. I'm not too familiar with the sector entirely, but I remember a very famous name by Mehret Debeb or something like that. Was a long time serving like CEO of the power company, and kind of one of the few, true technocrats in a deserved place or whatever. So I don't know. So what kind? I don't know. Maybe if you can reflect, if there is any push, and back between, if there is any details that you can share between these kind of characters and also probably the politicians, and how actually specifically the interaction between these two groups, materialized, would be, I think, interesting to hear. But again, I think with regard to, I think, the power sector, especially post-Mellis, there was another interesting sector where this, the need to install more technocratic policy making and implementation was being attempted, at least still within a very important sector of the economy, headed by Arkaba. Around investment, trade, and expansion of industrial parks and so on and so forth. There was at least an attempt, what looked like an attempt to professionalize things and at least bring within even at least some high level, bureaucratic positions, more technocratically able personalities. But and we've heard of quite a lot of tension between, maybe one of the reasons, I don't know, I want to reflect on that, for the failure of the power sector, at least in terms of the ability to implement the projects, is rather the involvement of the military, and the military's rather insistence on keeping things in their own turf, through and through when it comes to implementing those policies. I think that would be interesting to probably discuss. Thank you.
I think there's a couple there, so if you guys want to take that one, I'll read the ones from the chat after that.
Fana, maybe?
Okay, so let me also, Abdulatif raised, I think, 3 questions. One relating to, this tension or relationship between technocrats and politicians in the context of the regulatory authority, which was, established in 1998. And the information we have from all our informants is that although the Ethiopian Electric Authority was supposed to regulate and somehow keep a leash on the power generation company, it didn't have the technical capacity, it didn't have the kind of senior kind of technical people to do it, and it was not well endowed when it comes to resource. So at the end of the day, it was always EP or EPCO which had greater kind of resources to do that. Even under Mehret Debebe, and then even Seleshi, the current minister, coming to to the position of leading that the ministry, Seleshi, and Mehret Debebe leading EPCO. There is an interesting dynamics to the extent that the board, for example, they say that it meets every week, very regularly, very frequently. In a way, the one informant I remember saying, paraphrasing, but still saying that it was, you know, the board more or less acting like, you know, the CEO, and the CEO acting more like, you know, executing or, you know, administering the decisions. So we have that dynamics again between those. So I'm not, you know, reducing the, you know, technical or professional capabilities of these two individuals, but there was also that, you know, overbearing kind of presence of the politicians. And I think it's the same with this question on Arkaba, and, you know, in the second GTP period, especially after 2016, I think end of, you know, the second half of 2016, we also see a number of you know, people technically capable people coming to ministerial positions. We have Engineer Seleshi coming to taking on that ministerial position at the Ministry of Water. But even then, as I've said earlier, the board had greater powers. When it comes to you know, where to attribute the blame for the failure of the different power projects, the military MITEC obviously takes, you know, a significant part of the, you know, share of the blame when it comes to GERD. But this failure of the projects was even before GERD. So we have the same with Gebresenbet, the same with Beles and the other dams. So one, it was not primarily about MITEC or the military, but also, you know, more inherent, more kind of you know, ingrained is the relationship between the politicians and technocrats. Biruk, Tom?
I don't think I have anything useful to add to what you've said. So, Tom?
Yeah, I'm just thinking what to add. I mean, I think in terms of the industrial parks, I mean, it's clear that, you know, there was a huge amount of time spent trying to learn from other countries' experiences and try and develop capacity around industrial parks. It's also clear that, again, there were some fairly major mistakes made, particularly around power. So, I mean, one of the, you know, a lot of the parks were built and then there was a failure to actually connect them. So somewhere between, you know, the investment corporation, the Industrial Parks Development Corporation, and then the electric utilities, there was some fairly major planning problems with the result that, you know, you had parks, I'm not quite sure of the current situation, but for a considerable period of time, which weren't connected to power and didn't have the power that they required, and therefore delayed the interest from investors as a result, and, you know, quite costly mistakes around that. So yes, I mean, I think it's, again, it's a sort of a bit of a mixed pattern. I'm just looking through the questions. There was a question we didn't address in the text there's one around the GERD. So how do you evaluate the GERD in the context of Ethiopia's electricity policy? What would happen at transboundary level if inattention to maintenance continued? I mean, first thing to say that none of the three of us are engineers. And so I'm not really in a position to comment on, I presume your point is related to downstream impacts of failure of the dam or something, which I have no ability to comment on whatsoever. I mean, I think in terms of the GERD in the context of electricity policy, I mean, I think many of the same challenges, and this isn't, you know, these aren't particularly our findings, we're trying to understand the decision-making process, but it's, you know, a lot of people have written about how the GERD, like other dams, is quite have questioned the design in terms of the high installed capacity and the low plant factor, where essentially, I mean, the GERD on its own, if it was completed today, would have considerably more installed capacity than is required for peak demand, and essentially you would only be able to operate it at, to produce year-round energy, you would only operate it at about a third of its capacity. So I mean, I think there are questions there around, you know, how efficient the GERD and many of these other projects are in terms of, yeah, the investment in and the particular design that it's taken. There's another question which I got sent to me in a direct message, so which was how do you consider the role of international contractors and consultants in this process? Who initiates the idea of going for these low plant factors? Which I think is a very valid question. I mean, from what we found, it would seem that the main decision-making processes around these dams was primarily between very senior people. So Mellers, the deputy prime minister at times, and the contractors. So Salini and Metek. But yeah, I mean, those discussions obviously are not terribly transparent, and it's hard to really unpick quite what went on in that. But and I think it's fair to raise the question. I mean, the view from the contractors that we've managed to speak to was definitely that the push was coming from the politician side. Obviously, we're not able to interview Mellers or Gebresenbet about their view on it. But yeah, somewhere between those different parties, these designs have come out. But I mean, certainly statements that Gebresenbet made when he was deputy prime minister were very clear that his view on it was that installed capacity was good, going for the biggest possible installed capacity was good, and he made no attempt to hide that. And he was definitely claiming credit for it himself. So in that sense, there was a sort of a clear steer that it was more from the politician side. But yeah, these are difficult processes to really unpick.
I think there was another question in the chat on, could you please shed more light, if there is time, on those split conversations spoken about within the EPRDF along the lines of reform, liberalization, private sector involvement? In the presentation, we talk about the 2001 split, but in a follow-up paper, we are engaging with those debates more recently, and the sort of recent move, not only away from hydropower, but also the involvement of independent power producers. And so I don't know if it's worth engaging here now, or if Tom or Fana want to speak more at length on this, but there is a shift currently underway as we speak in the last 3-4 years, where you see a dual shift, not only away from dams and hydropower, but also away from state-led investments towards more private sector investments. So there's a sort of dual transition taking place. One of the reasons being that private investors obviously are not interested in investing in hydropower and dams, but are more interested in solar and wind, but also partly a result of the massive debt accumulated in the sector, meaning that securing financing for any future projects is very, very difficult.
I think we've time for a couple more questions. So if anyone has any questions, yeah, please raise a hand, but it's a small enough group, so you can just unmute yourself and ask it as well. We'll give it just another minute.
Looks like we're all out of questions.
I guess, yeah, we can finish on time, which is nice. So then, yeah, if there's no questions, I don't see any in chat either. Thank you, Tom, Biruk, and Fana, for sharing your work. It was really exciting. And everyone else, thank you for attending. I just want to plug our website. If you're not familiar with our research program, we're FutureDAMS, and we're an interdisciplinary team of researchers working on the design and assessment of water, energy, food, environment mega systems. I think that's the full form of it. But yeah, just go on to www.futuredams.org and you'll find all the information about our project there. We're in our 4th year now. There's a lot of research output coming out, and you can find all the information there, including information on our upcoming webinars and seminar series. So thank you all for attending, and special thank you to our 3 speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.